So this is going to be the demonstration that we'll do today, and it's a mixed media piece. It's called Voyage to Michaelania, and this demonstration will show lots of techniques: texturing the working ground, employing ink transfers, monoprinting, creating custom multi-dimensional accents, embossing, debossing, sgraffito, spattering, sponging, dry brushing, and the list kind of goes on. So it's kind of my hope that you will pull something from these different techniques that I show in my piece to apply it to your work and to your process, and maybe change it up and expand upon what I've done and do something unique in and of itself. This particular portrait is used by creating or utilizing, I should say, a bunch of elements. The color palette and the design inspiration for the mask and the jewelry actually came from the rainforest, including tropical plant life, birds, animals. Placed above the head, sort of in the mind's eye, and you'll see more of a detail of this later on, is a dragonfly, which symbolizes change and self-realization. And the dragonfly is also known as a metaphor for insight and wisdom and deeper understanding to the meaning of life. In my mixed media work, whether it's abstract or representational areas in nature and in the work, each element in the composition sort of takes on its own specific role in the telling of a provocative visual tale. Now I'm going to hear and read to you what the journal excerpts from my journals that I use to kind of help me create this painting. A humble servant by day and a traveler by night, the young peasant girl dreams of a world known only to her in books. In the silence of the dark, the mind wanders past the earthly presence to another realm of existence. Like a captain of a ship, the courageous heart braves the unknown waters to explore new ports over the horizon. Through the amazing journey, she discovers her true potential, and her ultimate destiny reveals itself. So that was kind of the impetus of that painting. So let's get into the steps. Well, first you got to establish the character or the subject of the piece. This figure is drawn, like I told you before, is on clayboard panel. And I used graphite pencils, blending stumps, and a kneaded eraser. Sometimes with paintings, I'll also, especially the larger ones that are done on masonite that's been gessoed, I'll actually use graphite powder. But this one I actually didn't. The clayboard surface is like glass. It's very, very smooth. I used fixative to seal the drawing, and also I had to put some acrylic matte medium to further seal the surface. Couple hints about the clayboard: very absorbent. And don't underestimate when they say on the instructions, this surface is very absorbent. They're not kidding. I had to put several layers, I think, of acrylic matte medium just to get the comfort zone of what I feel is comfortable or a level of absorption, because it's very absorbent. So just keep that in mind. So this is basically the drawing that I started out with. It's a detail. Obviously, it went down longer. Texturing the ground. What I love to do is I love a lot of texture. I think when you create a pre-existing density in your work, anything that you put on top with paint or other mediums, it kind of gives it a drag. It gives it a different feel than a smooth surface would. So what I love is I took Bristol board and printmaking paper, and I ripped them into shapes. But I always like to have some kind of conceptual reason why I do things. So with these shapes, I ripped them into tropical leaves, feathers, flowers, fruits. I mean, not specifically totally accurate, but somewhat of the semblance of those shapes. And then what I did is I took the pieces and I overlapped them and adhered them to the clayboard surface. I used bookbinder's glue, which is pH neutral, and I basically put the cut ripped paper pieces, I actually put them all around the portrait. So every area that's in the background, the negative space you could say, has this collage pieces on it. And then what I usually do anytime I adhere a collage is I'll use wax paper on top and then roll it with a brayer to kind of remove any air bubbles. And like I said, this kind of creates this visually dense environment with different absorbency levels, because Bristol board and printmaking paper have completely different ways in which they absorb paint. And it kind of alters the way the paint interacts with the surface later on, and I love that. And there's one other thing I want to mention too, And we talk about this in experimental painting. It's how you rip paper, whether you rip it towards yourself or you rip it away. That actually also creates a different kind of an edge. And that's an interesting thing, too, aesthetically, once this texture kind of builds up. Employing ink transfers. I love to go to zoos, specifically Central Park in New York City. They have this unbelievable bird sanctuary there where the birds actually fly freeform in the atrium, and so you can kind of get up really close to them and do sketches. And so I do a lot of things. Like I said, I bring my sketchbooks, my journals all the time. And what I did is I had a whole bunch of sketches of tropical plants and birds and things like that. And I took those sketches and I scanned them into the computer, and I created these graphic line art printouts. And I printed on Bristol board and basically with pigment inks. And using a painting knife, I coated the drawings with acrylic, matte, gel medium, and then I applied them face down onto the surface above the areas of the face. And you're going to see this in the next slide. Of course, I used a brayer on top to burnish the ink to the ground. And when it dried, I lifted the Bristol board up. And what happens is the ink from the inkjet printer that's on the surface stays embedded into the matte medium, the gel medium, matte gel medium. And to get the remaining paper off, I kind of just rub it away. And some areas will remain, you know, seen, and others will be totally removed because it's not like a perfect print, but that's what I like about it. And what I do is I layer a bunch of those up on the top area of the face, which you'll see in a couple of seconds. And then I just take the whole thing and acrylic matte medium, regular matte medium, not gel matte medium, and I cover the surface. And the area above her face, prior to the paint, was all of these dark dark imprints, and you can kind of see them still coming through. Anywhere that you see this kind of black layers of things in these areas that I'm pointing out with my cursor, that's all from that ink transfer process. Now, to cover the face, I use Frisket, and I cut it with a craft knife, and I cut a mask so I protect the facial area. It allows me to kind of paint real freeform without having to worry about being careful. I think that's kind of important. And when I was doing this piece, especially a lot of the painting of the background, I listened to the native sounds of the Amazon rainforest on a CD that actually was embedded with what they call alpha brainwave pulses. It supposedly creates or stimulates creativity and mental focus, and it's a great CD. And what I did is I applied washes of acrylic paint with brushes to the surface, and then I took cotton cloth and I kind of sculpted it into kind of an interesting, wad, and then I blotted the wet acrylic paint. This kind of gives you a texture, but also gives you differences in value of the paint that you apply on top. I also used an altered roller. The paint roller, I actually cut into it and create a texture there. And in experimental painting, there's actually a whole section on just different techniques that I use with rollers and brayers and all of this stuff. I also use a painting knife and some sponges to apply more opaque application. Tried to keep it to somewhat of a tropical color palette, and I make these color notes in my sketchbooks when I draw, and I say, oh wow, this bird has this color of blue or this red, or I always have those notations in my sketchbook, and then I later use that when I'm doing more finished work. This sort of type of automatism and freeform painting where I kind of react to an outside stimuli, here it happened to be sounds of the rainforest, is actually something that was developed by the Surrealists. And it was first developed in the drawing process, and later they used it for the painting process. And my book, Art Revolution, actually goes even into more detail into into this process, as well as other historically significant art movements that have really influenced mixed media art. So if you really want to find some different ways of working, that historical connection may be a real good tie-in for you. So Art Revolution not only has that historical aspect, but also it has some of 21 of the top mixed media artists working today in 2D, 3D, digital, and new media. their demos were actual real projects done in the film, entertainment, advertising, and music business. So even the demos were culturally significant works that were done. So that's just an insight of what's going on in Art Revolution. And if you can see in the next thing, I'm doing some monoprinting. Now with monoprinting, I ended up using as my printing plate, and we're looking at this section here on the left, is just clear, transparent plastic. I adhered it to a white, rigid surface so I could actually see through it. Real easy. Painter's tape helps to hold it down. And just using a sponge roller, I took ivory black acrylic onto this non-absorbent surface, sort of rolled it out. Then I wadded up this regular old plastic wrap and debossed it into the wet painting surface, and the brayer kind of really helps it get in there. So I'm kind of creating my monoprinting plate. But before it's dry, I remove that custom plate and place it face down onto, we're looking on the right now, my masked area of the working surface. Again, I'm using Frisket to protect certain areas. And I burnish the back side of the printing plate with the brayer. And then when I lift it off, the custom plate reveals a very subtle but graphic imprint. Now, if I would have done that direct texture onto the surface, it would have been very heavy and also in the opposite. So I wanted something that was much more subtle. And then I use acrylic matte medium on top as sort of an isolation coat to kind of protect it. Now, depending on the dryness of your studio or where your studio is located, whatever time of the year it is, if you're finding when you're doing this technique your acrylic paint is drying a little bit too fast, you can actually use an extender in the paint to compensate for that if you're having issues with drying time.